I'm Sarah Cole, and I'm going to welcome you all to the afternoon session. I'm not doing the introductions today. My colleague Matt Hart will do those in a moment. But I just wanted, first of all, to say a few thanks on behalf of the whole day, and especially of the afternoon panel. Eileen Galuli, of course, and Conley Lawrence, who's walking around. The two of them made all of this possible, and thank you so much for providing food and a place and this fantastic group of people to talk for the day. So that's wonderful. Also wanted to give a warm thanks to Matt Hart and Emily Bloom. We three spent some time figuring out what we wanted to do for this afternoon session, and so you guys were great. And Matt isn't even presenting himself, so especially all the more selfless and generous, which is what he's like in general. So that's all great. I just wanted to tell you a little bit about what we came up with and what this round table, or not round table, this straight table is all about. The idea that we had was that, based in part on my own sense that a lot of people who are interested in the Rising are not necessarily working primarily on it in one way or another. And I really wanted there to be a chance here at Columbia this spring to think together about the event without having it to be a requirement that you're writing a book about it now or something like that. And as a modernist, I spent a lot of time thinking about the Rising in the context of many other kinds of things having to do with the period and also having to do with later years and into the next 100 years, in fact. So it seemed like an opportunity to bring together a group of people who work on Irish studies, among other things, and who would bring a conversation together about the Rising from as many perspectives as we thought interesting. So it's really meant to be gestural and generative provocations rather than papers. I've asked everybody to speak for around 7 minutes, which, as all of you know, is nothing. So, in fact, when I was putting mine together the other day, I thought, well, this is pretty unsatisfying, I think. So my idea at the beginning was it would be very satisfying because you would get these little brilliant tidbits and then we wouldn't have to show anything, actually. So maybe we'll go with that spirit. But anyway, so the idea was that we're each presenting for a short period and then we'll open it up to discussion. Two things: we're not going to do lengthy intros. The website is fantastic and actually clicks you to long bios, and I definitely invite you there. And of course, to read all of our books and articles and know everything about us, but not right now. And then the other thing this is just a pet peeve of mine, that when you have a long, big round table like this, then often what happens is after everyone's spoken, then the organizer says, I'd like to give the panel a chance to respond first, and that takes up the whole discussion period. So we're not going to do that. It's going to be a proper discussion. I invite everybody to discuss, and you can certainly ask questions in the normal fashion. I'd like to ask Therese a question about her paper, but also feel free to not ask a question but make a comment, and we can see if it will work as a genuine discussion. And of course, all of us will participate. So we'll see how that goes, breaking some of the typical kind of rules for these things, and maybe we'll all just revert to type and have Q&A, but we'll try to do it a little bit in a more open spirit. So that's the idea, and thank you again, Matt, for agreeing to do the quick intros. And we're going to go in this order, which is alphabetical. The program is close to alphabetical. That my 7-year-old could give us some advice on alphabetizing, but anyway, we did get it right for the table itself.
All right, thank you, Sarah. I have one thing to do, and that's to introduce people and to try and make it myself not so aware that Emily's laughing at me about how much she's enjoying the pleasure I take in the alphabetical organisation. So Emily Bloom is visiting assistant professor at Columbia University. Her book, The Wireless Past, Anglo-Irish Writers and the BBC, 1931 to 68, is forthcoming from Oxford University Press, and it connects modernist aesthetics with the rise of radio broadcasting. Sarah Cole is Professor of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia, where she currently serves as Department Chair and therefore my boss. She is the author of 2 books, At the Violet Hour, Modernism and Violence in England and Ireland, from Oxford in 2012, and Modernism, Male Friendship and the First World War, from Cambridge in 2003. Therese Cox is a doctoral candidate in the English department at Columbia University, and I'm her boss. And she's the author of several published stories and essays, including most recently Appropriations of Michael Collins, which appeared this month in the Stinging Flies 1916-themed issue in the wake of the Rising. Gregory Londe is assistant professor in the English department at Cornell, and among many other publications is the editor of The Cracked Looking Glass from 2010, a collection of original essays by writers such as Paul Muldoon, Colin Tabine, Paige Reynolds, Terence Brown, Claire Wills, and others that traces the history of Irish prose from 1800 to the present. Janet Lyon is Associate Professor of English at Penn State University and the author of Manifestos, Provocations of the Modern, which, among many other great qualities, offers a history and theory of the manifesto form, including and especially the manifestos of the early 20th century. And finally today, Paul Saint-Amour is Associate Professor of English at the University of Pennsylvania and the author of 2 books, The Copyrights, Intellectual Property and the Literary Imagination, from Cornell in 2003. It won the MLA Prize for Best First Book, and Tense Future, Modernism, Total War, Encyclopedic Form, out last year from Oxford University Press. So if you please join me in welcoming our panelists for this afternoon's roundtable. Emily.
Okay, so I'm alphabetically first, so that means I go first. And I want to just start by saying that when we think about the Easter Rising, we tend to think of major urban landmarks. We think about the General Post Office, St. Stephen's Green, Boland's Mill, Kilmainham Jail, right? These sort of archetypal buildings. We are less likely to consider the Irish School of Wireless Telegraphy. But on the first day of the Rising, a small group of Irish volunteers were dispatched to this location in order to commandeer a radio set. After repairing a transmitter, the rebels broadcast a message written by James Connolly proclaiming that the Irish Republican Army had taken over Dublin. And they used so they said, we have taken over all the buildings, right? It was very hyperbolic. And Arthur Shields was one of them, one of this group. So from the station, the soldiers were able to transmit but not receive messages. So Marshall McLuhan describes this as the world's first radio broadcast. Whereas early uses of radio involved point-to-point communication from one wireless receiver to another participant, it was during the Rising that a wireless transmission, according to McLuhan, was first used to spread information to anyone who happened to be tuned into the right frequency. So in the highly censored environment of World War I, radio broadcasting offered new possibilities for conveying information beyond the official constraints of print media. And this takes us back to one of our first talks. Irish volunteers were particularly hopeful that an American ship would intercept the message and would convey it to Irish-American sympathizers. So like all of McLuhan's stories, this is a great story, but not 100% accurate. There had been an earlier broadcast of a music broadcast, but I do believe that Connolly's announcement was really one of the first uses of pirate broadcasting and one of the first moments where someone illegally co-opted the radio medium for revolutionary purposes. So I want to take seriously Christopher Morash's claim that the Rising was a media event as much as it was a military operation. Broadcasting by the Irish volunteers reveals the complex internal dynamics within the Rising. The fight for national independence, what the Sinn Féin Party would champion as ourselves alone, also relied on global communication networks. This same dynamic would emerge again after the Rising, when the first president of the Irish Free State, Douglas Hyde, inaugurated the Irish Broadcasting Service, then called 2ARN. On the 1st of January 1926, Hyde delivered an inaugural speech that made the station's national agenda explicit. And he's speaking in Irish. I am going to read you an English translation for many reasons. He begins by saying, "It is a sign to the world that times have changed when we can take our place amongst other nations and use the wireless in our own language. Air is not completely saved yet, and it will not be until the foreign influence is wiped out. I hope this wireless will be an advantage both physically and mentally to the body." So the rhetoric of this passage reveals an underlying anxiety about whether radio would aid or undermine Irish nationalism. On the one hand, we see the desire to keep up with other Western nations, even as, on the other hand, the service is imagined as a force enabling Ireland to wipe out foreign influences. In the Irish original, the word wireless, and I'm going to botch this, is an glas gan srag, meaning a device without wires. This very literal translation makes even more apparent the sense of wireless technology as a rootless one, untethered to a base, whether local, regional, or national. So the Irish writers that I address in my larger project are Yeats, Elizabeth Bowen, Louis MacNeice, and Samuel Beckett. And they were all acutely interested in this tension within radio broadcasting between its usefulness as a tool for emerging nationalist movements and later for totalitarian regimes, and also its inexorably anti-national drives as a global communication technology. Broadcasting from its very first use in the Easter Rising reveals the double valence of 20th century nationalism as both a vehement rejection of foreign influences and a product of modern media networks through which the national is always mediated by the global. So I'll start to wrap it up just with one example. I'm trying to be on time, especially since I'm first, I have to set a good precedent. So I'll just end with one example. When the Irish playwright Denis Johnston pitched a radio play about the Easter Rising to the BBC in 1958, it was rejected and labeled as political dynamite. In fact, Johnston originally conceived of the play setting as Jerusalem, and then changed it to what he called the equally dynamite topic of Dublin in 1916. In his preface to the play, Johnston describes the Rising as the opening phase in the passing of an imperial civilization, and notes that the events of 1916 were not an Irish but a world phenomenon. This version of the global nature of the Rising was particularly threatening to the BBC in the 1950s, an era of accelerating decolonization. In rejecting Johnston's script, the BBC producer John Gibson mentioned the political implications of the play, but concluded by dismissing the Rising as a stale subject. He writes, "One is left at the end with a feeling of sadness that Johnston should trouble to rake around in these dead ashes yet again." So why, Gibson might well ask, should we continue to rake these same ashes during this year of the 100th anniversary of the Rising? If the Rising was a tired topic in 1958, how much more so in 2016? I'm trying to be provocative. So although Johnston points out that his was one of the few sort of feature-length plays about the Rising, and his title is modeled explicitly on Sean O'Casey's The Plough and the Stars, it already felt like the theme had been rehearsed to oblivion. And yet his urge to write about the Rising, and I want to suggest our own desire to write about the Rising, is also an attempt to situate it in global terms. The takeover of the Irish School of Wireless Telegraphy stands as a key site for understanding the Rising as a world phenomenon. When we make the wireless central to narratives of the Easter Rising, the event offers powerful precedents for later anti-colonial resistances and protest movements today. If there are still burning embers within the dead coals of the Rising, I would like to posit that they can be found precisely in attempting to understand the event as a world phenomenon, and to this end, clarifying its foundational role in media history.
This has been a season of anniversaries. The little presentation I'm going to give picks up on what turned out to be a kind of sub-theme in the morning's panel about these anniversaries. For those of us who work on World War I, and I know there are at least a few of us in this room, the last 2 years have been a whirlwind of commemorative conferences, publications, new editions, special issues, museum shows, and general reflection on this last century. And the same can be said in a slightly shorter time frame for those of us who work on the Rising. The war certainly lends itself to commemoration insofar as its consequences were so extensive, its disturbances so massive and so sickening, its roster of participants so vast, and its meaning so rich and subject to ongoing contestation. And yet, when it comes to locating it in time, the situation is much murkier. The mad rush to commemorate was in 2014. Perhaps I like to think in imitation of the throngs of men who swarmed all the recruiting stations in August and September of 1914. But I, for one, did a lot of grumbling at the time at the piling up of all of these events. I could not see why we needed to commemorate everything at the beginning. Wouldn't other years be more relevant for the kinds of things we want to say about the war, such as the year of the Somme, 1916, on which more in a moment, or 1917 with its feudal battles at Passchendaele and the Revolution, not to mention 1918. Is the year even the best signifier as we return to the war with its phases, seasons, pauses, and ultimate sense of unendingness? The Rising, by contrast, feels so clean and clear in temporal terms. 1 week in 1 year, a small and recognizable cast of characters, an event we can name, study, and know. It's highly appropriate, I think, that Yeats's poem on the Rising takes the approach of familiarity. I have seen them at close of day, is how it begins. And its burden is in figuring out how to recognize sublimity in the local. To commemorate the Rising seems straightforward in a certain way, then, since we can locate it in space and time. And if you think about some of the commemorations going on, the interest in particular blocks in Dublin, or even a particular window of a particular building. So the Rising epitomizes the historical event, a happening with lasting import and significance that can be plotted in a temporal sequence and separated out from its before and after. What I want to think about in my few minutes today is just what this durational difference in commemoration might offer for our thinking about these two historical episodes, the war and the Rising, or more generally, wartime and insurrectionary time. I've become increasingly interested over the last few years in the idea that there are varied and surprising temporalities that emerge in and around war, and that these fundamentally shape the experience, its representation, and its meaning. Sometimes time is radically compressed. I think of Hemingway's For Whom the Bell Tolls, which gives us the Spanish Civil War by compacting it into 4 days. Sometimes expanded. Quote, "It had no beginning and will have no end, war, the alpha and omega, world without end," as the great nurse memoirist Mary Borden mused about World War I. It was often repetitive, sunset and sunrise and sunset and sunrise, as Paul Fussell reminds us. Each day uncannily like the previous and the next, but each day also incredibly precious because possibly one's last. There are many, many ways in which time warps and twists in and around war. And one paradigmatic form is for the singularity of any given war to give way to war as ongoing or perpetual, to use one of the terms Paul Saint-Amour down there explores in his beautiful recent book, Tense Future. Here's Mary Favret, whose book War at a Distance makes a strong case for a whole sensibility of overlaps, continuities, echoes, and carryovers across the wartime field from the Napoleonic Wars to those of today. As she writes, quote, "Wartime has trouble measuring its distance from other times of war. It produces a history of the present always permeable to other presents, other wartimes. Rather than provide the history of a past period, it records the vestiges of an unlimited present, sentient of a war without limits. Duration, the perpetual, a resistance to event and an emphasis on condition, an understanding of war's violence as having its slow usages and its qualities of long-term terror. These have come to the forefront in my thinking about war and in the thinking, I believe, of a number of wonderful critics, I should say, in a way that other got in the wrong place in the sentence, in a way that works partly against the notion of commemoration, since if war resists its own seeming temporality of beginnings and ends, we don't know what or when to mark. It should be clear, I hope, that such a view of time and war is at least partially counterintuitive, since wars are par excellence the shapers of history, pre-war, post-war, interwar. And yet, perhaps those very terms remind us of how war stretches beyond its chronological boundaries. To contemplate the Rising, one enters the temporality not of war, but of insurrection. And insurrectionary time, I think, necessitates the event. How can one endure the long-term realities of occupation, colonization, suppression, without the liberating event, the unleashing of national sentiment, and the brief glimpse of a different future? The national story of Ireland in the revolutionary period was, as we know, often told as a series of years: 1798, 1803, 1867, 1916. These dates matter. They give concrete reality to what is ordinarily stifled. They provide a revised past and a view of national history in the making. They chart a system of temporality, where stretches of time can be left quiet, preparation perhaps, or waiting, while other moments emerge in significant focus. In anti-colonial uprising, different kinds of symbolic value inhere in these dates and in time itself. The future has a special purchase, and as critics like David Scott, the anthropologists, have shown, the experience of time may have to be constantly reconceptualized as hope deferred or as horizons of change ever extended. The Rising, moreover, was conceived within a frame of redemptive time, under the sign of resurrection and rebirth. It was symbolic and it was real and equal in shared measures. Event can subsume events, as in Yeats's poem, which skips over the violent days themselves, jumping from before to after, focusing on symbolic transformations. The Rising was an event in time, which casts its own shadow, or maybe we should say light, back across history. And it was also understood as being about time, too, an event to give substance and meaning to the now and to prefigure the future. And so the inevitable question with which I will leave you is, how do these two different temporal schemes, or maybe schemes is too strong a word, we could say clusters or configurations, how do these two temporal configurations appear when viewed together? Are there ways in which the insights of anti-colonial time mingle with and recast wartime perpetualness? Or how can an understanding of the long, complex spans of war violence recharacterize the eventness of 1916? I'll just make two very partial and preliminary suggestions. One is to say that, of course, there's nothing actually stable about the Rising as singular event in time. We need only to look at the temporalities that follow, whether it's up to 1922, stretch all the way up to the 70s, or reconfigured by 1998, or whatever it may be, to recognize how the symbolic register of a given date or event provides shape, value, encouragement to much longer and messier histories, and how, needless to say, any such happening is always subject to revision, as in this anniversary and in this event today. The second suggestion, coming from the other side, is to note how desperately the First World War was looking for just such a reorienting event as the Rising. There was no glorious failure in World War I, no loss that signifies gain, no romantic leaders to be martyred, nor were there even narratable military events. The British military authorities, those great thinkers, as my dad would say, envisioned the Somme as just such an event. This would be the battle as turning point. And perhaps it was, but not in the way they'd hoped. Instead, as it bled forward over the months with no resolution and no value, it came to stand precisely for the war as the very opposite of generative event, war rather as waste. 1916 then, rising, falling, meaning, meaninglessness, time in our hands, time subject to the logic only of futility.
Thank you, Sarah. So I wanted to talk about some contemporary responses to the Rising that are happening right now at the current moment. Certainly the Rising is an event that has been imagined and reimagined many times in literature and fiction and in drama. The first example that comes to mind, of course, is Sean O'Casey's The Plough and the Stars, which dramatizes the events of the Rising, all the way up to the late 90s, Roddy Doyle, A Star Called Henry, kind of reimagining the Rising through the eyes of a 14-year-old boy who's fighting alongside the Rising. And I wanted to just begin by asking a few questions. Why has this moment in history provoked such an interest, not just from historians and literary critics, but also from writers of fiction and poetry? And to just discuss what I see as some of the forms that contemporary literature is taking on today to address the issue of how do we think about the Rising. And perhaps a more philosophical question, which is what can fiction do that perhaps history or literary criticism cannot do or attempts to, and what is the potential of imaginative literature to reinvigorate the debates and the conversations that are happening around the Rising. In his influential book, We Irish, Dennis Donahue wrote, "We are still annotating Yeats's sense of romantic Ireland and the values proposed by the phrase." This was 30 years ago that he wrote it, but it's certainly still true. So I wonder, is it possible to annotate Yeats's sense of romantic Ireland in an imaginative, or from an imaginative, not just a critical standpoint? And can imaginative literature serve as a form of criticism? And I want to discuss this a little bit from my own background as kind of two perspectives. One, as a scholar of literature, and also as someone who writes fiction. And I first, I want to talk a little bit about an edition that just recently came out. This is an Irish literary journal called The Stinging Fly. And an issue recently was just published called In the Wake of the Rising. And back in the spring of last year, the guest editor and novelist Sean O'Reilly put out a call for submissions in which writers were asked to respond freely to the principles in the proclamation, to the story of the Rising, its place in our cultural memory, and the current state of the country we see ourselves as part of, and the country we see ourselves as having some hand in. Furthermore, O'Reilly's invitation invited writers to reevaluate and reclaim the vision of the 1916 Easter Rising and to engage with the state of the Republic today, the social conditions in which they actually do their writing, and to contribute to a debate on the color of the horizon we should be aiming for. So there's a real sense in this of having a conversation not just with the past or the present, but also the future. And the provocation was part of a larger conversation and debate in Ireland, furthered by groups like Reclaim the Vision of 1916, a collective of writers, musicians, and artists who wanted to take back the Rising from the politicians. That it's necessary 100 years on to reinterpret and re-examine the Rising, both as a historical event in its own right, but also as it reflects on the principles of what an Irish republic stands for today, was the provocation. So how did some writers choose to respond? So the issue was just released last month. And just to provide an overview of some of the, I'm very interested in the different kinds of forms that emerged. So, for example, we have Val Nolan's story in tweets, #Rising, where a live tweet reenactment of the Rising plays out alongside the usual white noise of social media in 2016. The proposal being, is social media the new form of social realism? Or take Donald O'Kelly's play about the real-life Dublin figure, Frank Sheehy Skeffington, pacifist, feminist, socialist, atheist, which plays out as a rambling, irreverent oral history of the Rising, as told by a present-day foul-mouthed beggar clad in a sleeping bag begging outside of a modern-day ATM. It is, as we learn, quote, the shitty sleeping bag of history that in the end is thrown unceremoniously into a dumpster. These are just a few of the more kind of irreverent responses. Yet what emerges is many of the entries share an engagement with very familiar tropes of the Rising: blood sacrifice, redemptive violence, martyrdom, futility, and above all, romantic or unromantic Ireland. Yet many of these writers also engage by refusing to respond to the Rising as a relevant historical event, or perhaps to turn it on its head. So take a character from Gavin Corbett's Transition Year, who finds more romance, excitement, and relevance in a Wikipedia page of history than he does standing above the streets where 100 years prior the violent Rising was actually playing out. And a few of these stories seem very eager to take up Basil Fawlty's admonition, don't mention the war. Lucy Swinburne, Belinda McKeown, Gavin Corbett, as mentioned before. So to return to that question that I don't have a satisfying answer to, but what can fiction of the Rising do that criticism can't? I want to maybe propose a few provocations, which is perhaps there is more room in fictional form, in drama, to reimagine history. So whether that be what we think of as more historical fiction, as the example of Roddy Doyle, A Star Called Henry, or several stories from The Stinging Fly. Paul Lynch has a wonderful story that really takes us into the moment of 1916. There's room to certainly reenact the certain tropes of the Rising, either seriously or with certain ironic distance, but also to reevaluate our relation to literature and histories of the Rising. And this sometimes is writing as a refusal, as a rebellion, as an insurrection against predictable narrative, writing as a form of protest. And perhaps one of the benefits of fiction and drama is that we do have more room for maneuver, experimentation. Perhaps it's not always about answering questions so much as raising provocations. So from my standpoint, I responded to this provocation that Sean O'Reilly set forward with a short story that ended up being published here as Appropriations of Michael Collins. As the title suggests, it's a work very conscious of its own complex relation to history, a narrative that's very engaged with the questions and very skeptical of posing those questions in fiction in the first place. In a very real sense, the short story was my way of wrestling with two different perspectives. That of a narrator, a young American whose only claim on the history of the Rising is a romantic attachment to the figure of Michael Collins, and that of her former lover, who is now an academic, presenting a lecture on Michael Collins at an event perhaps very much like this one. The story was my way of working through the persistence of the romantic imagination of the Rising, mobilizing two perspectives, fiction versus fact. While today I'm here to argue for a generative overlap between the two, in the story I dramatize the gap between the two perspectives, criticism and literature. They cannot, in the story, connect. In practice, I do see a gap between the cool, clinical eye of criticism and the raw, emotional language of the imaginative experience of fiction. And I do wonder how we might more effectively bridge that gap. And that, to my mind, is what makes the issue of Stinging Fly so successful, and I want to argue, in fact, necessary, is the flexibility of the different voices and genres, the benefit of putting them side by side in conversation one another and under one roof. So in closing, I just want to put forth the provocation that creating new literature around a past event is both a productive and a necessary act, one we need to bring into conversation with current literary criticism.
Got a handout of some poems, I believe. Hey there. A bunch of them went out before. They're not strictly necessary. I'm very glad that Sarah introduced this question of durational differences in commemoration. Had I been able to formulate that into a phrase, that would have been in here. Instead, this is about a series of poems that I can't read in the original, as compared with a play that I have neither read in its entirety nor seen in its entirety. But both offer different contrasting temporalities. So what you have are some poems by Maura McEntee. Here, Father, is this where it started? Here we became strangers to each other. Was it here? Asks Maura McEntee. The first few lines of her poem, Trouble Spot, General Post Office, 1986. McEntee addresses her father, Sean McEntee, participant in the 1916 uprising, who then held crucial positions in the Fianna Fáil government for 40 years. This poem is one of a suite of 3 lyrics that I've given you, grouped together in her 2011 bilingual selected poems that respond to the legacies of 1916, and it's the only one to speak in the first person and not the third person that she would call the voice of the tribe. The ambivalence of these poems, all of them in their own way, is fitting for a poet who's identified refusal as her principal theme, so it's great that you just were talking about that. In most of my poetry, she said, you can see that drawing back, bringing the poem right up to the crisis and pulling back elegantly, of course. In lines that would later supply the title of McEntee's memoir, which is called Same Age as the State, the poet declares herself a measure or a delegate of the Ireland founded in her birth year, 1922. I am the same age as the state, and neither turned out as you wished. So she both reflects and is the birth defect that she names in her poems on the 50th anniversary of the Rising. And these 3 poems set ideas of duty, principle, and code against the fragility of cracked embryos and the unknown youth who went missing. Drawing back. McEntee's responses to her father's uprising and her own raising both draw us back to the past and recoil from it. I've only recently begun work on McEntee's poems. It's difficult, as I say, because I don't have Gaelic myself, so I've been working with friends who could kind of help me with the translations, and I'd be interested if anyone notices details in them. But I bring her to attention because I think she deserves more attention as a poet, and because she's a poet who constantly charts the development of the state through her own proximity to an elegant refusal of the occasions of crisis. In this, she draws on her skills as a diplomat. She was Ireland's first female envoy in the diplomatic corps. Her memoir is brilliant on this, her being in Franco's Spain and so on. And she draws on these skills as a diplomat as she thinks about what it means to represent the state as envoy, as artist, as filial embodiment of what has gone astray. This comes out of some work that I'm doing right now on Irish poet diplomats. This whole generation, Dennis Devlin, Valentine Ironmonger, Richard Ryan, most recently Philip McDonough, who were both poets and diplomats, and who refracted that job's modes of negotiation and mediation by tweaking the locations and the occasions of lyric utterance, setting what are often recognizably modernist poems, fragmentation, cosmopolitan mobility, the self in the halls of power where the state has become that voice's patron and difficult muse. The 1916 uprising would seem to be anathema to the practice of diplomacy, at least in its tactics, if not in its sense of ceremony and delegation and broadcast. But the self-appointed allegorical status that the leaders of the Rising cultivated presented a challenge for later political envoys. You don't really see that many mentions of it across the 6 volumes of the Documents in Irish Foreign Policy series, for instance. I'm particularly interested in the semiotics of the figure of the delegate, which Pierre Bourdieu describes like this. The delegate is in a kind of relationship of metonymy with the group. She's part of the group which can function as a sign in the place of the totality of the group, but she's also a sign which speaks, which, as a spokesperson, can say what she is, what she does, what she represents herself representing. And this, I think, is the natural voice of the generation that followed the Rising and the Renaissance, where the prophetic has partially or incompletely transformed into the bureaucratic. Of the 3 poems on 1916 that I've given you, the middle one, Hatred, 1967, doesn't directly represent the Easter calamity. It thus requires some contextualization to address how this is a 1916 poem and why she might have grouped it with the others. Doing so finds Mackenzie her response nested within or in contrast to another literary text that I think could merit further study, which is a long way of saying, like, read it myself. John Arden and Margaretta Darcy's epic drama, The Non-Stop Connolly Show from 1975. Arden and Darcy's cycle of 6 plays, it's currently on in London, the first time that it's been produced in total in quite a while, though this is the shortened 13-hour version, I believe, that's on. Modeled on medieval guild mystery cycles, presents what Arden called a kind of giant pop festival for the left, staging the life of James Connolly up to and including his execution, though with a digressive structure that does not posit some inexorable endpoint in the Rising. The Non-Stop Connolly Show, true to its name, was first presented as a continuous 26-hour-long performance on Easter weekend, 1975. Its aim, in the words of one critic, to demonstrate, indeed to ask the audience to endure the problems of long-term political struggle. And it was staged first in Liberty Hall, the Dublin headquarters of the Irish Transport and General Workers Union. In her autobiography, Mackenzie abruptly transitions from a discussion of her distant involvement with the Biafran War in Nigeria to a summary of her involvement in New York with Arden's organization of demonstrations and these massive theatrical productions and sort of happenings in the streets in relation to anti-Vietnam demonstrations. In Biafra, she notes, the example of Ireland's 1916 Rising had become part of the mythology of Igbo independence, which we all sort of know through Achebe's use of Yeats, but broader than that even. And then she begins to describe her involvement, her invitation to present a poem at one of Arden's political cabarets, as he's starting to develop this form of agitprop endurance tests that would culminate in the Non-Stop Connolly Show. She writes in her memoir, Arden's idea of anti-war protest ran to street or at least barn theater, and his students loved them. I wrote a poem for one of his displays and called it Hatred. I think it's probably a good poem because John was not altogether happy with it. It is equivocal. The dissent here may be partly personal. John Arden had written a play called Armstrong's Last Good Night in 1963, which was subtitled An Exercise in Diplomacy. The play was based in part on Mackenzie's husband, Connor Cruz O'Brien's book about his time in the Congo as the head of the UN mission during the Katanga succession crisis in 1961. She accompanied him on that trip, though not in an official capacity as an emissary. And in her memoir, she quotes a single line from that play, spoken in a heavy Scots accent to an O'Brien-esque ambassador negotiating a borders dispute. I deem it unwise that your leman, your mistress, should accompany you on a diplomatic mission. December 6, 1967, anti-Vietnam protesters gather before dawn outside of the Draft Induction Center at 39 Whitehall Street downtown. Of the more than 2,500 anti-draft demonstrators, 264 are arrested, among them the bearded beatnik poet Allen Ginsberg, The Times notes that he was wearing finger symbols that made a cheerful tinkle as the police hustled him into a van. Parenting guru Dr. Benjamin Spock, who was 64 years old and still got roughed up by the cops. Thule Kupferberg, Arden McEntee, and Connor Cruz O'Brien, who was then Albert Schweitzer Professor of the Humanities at NYU. Then I'll cut. There's some stuff on the New York Times reporting of this where it doesn't credit her as sort of anyone other than daughter of Sean McEntee and wife of Connor Cruz O'Brien. It describes her. It quotes her describing Connor's injuries and the need to take him straight to the hospital. What might it mean to invoke 1916, not altogether approvingly, in the context of a mingled work of street theater and mass protest against U.S. imperialism? Or is it perhaps the very fact of being read at this demonstration that leads McEntee ultimately to group it with her two poems that more directly discuss the Rising? At the time of Arden's increasing involvement with street theater and political demonstrations, hatred does not play nice with his form of equating long performance with long memory and activity. It's a response to 1916 that adds some grit to the too easy comparison of historical anti-imperial rallies. Her poem offers a different vision of the duration of protest and mass gathering. For her, it is hatred that demands patience and deadened senses. This may be a poem about its own multiple forms of partially refused political identification, recalling the Rising in relation to protests against Vietnam and within sight of a multitude of nationalisms influenced by the Rising, its generality both courts and abjures comparative risingology. What's the difference then between protest and refusal? What's the temporality of this non-stop 1916 show, and can anyone exit the theater?
You know, we were supposed to talk about sort of the upshot and so forth, but I keep finding myself returning to the proclamation because I've written quite a bit about manifestos. I've read thousands of them. I've taught hundreds of them. And when I see one, there's almost this physiological response that I have to. So I'm just to start by looking, I look for generic and tonal and affective qualities that I see across the board in so many manifestos. And I've been familiar with this document for a really long time, but because of all of the media, the amazing coverage, I actually have started reading it with even more detached and analytic eyes. And I took it out of the print that is so familiar so that you can actually see it, right? You actually see the words that are in the document as opposed to the spectacle, the typographical spectacle of it. And what's hooking me about the proclamation these days is its subtle hybridity as a document and its reliance on the drama of secret mythic agency, which I want to consider here in these brief comments in order to point towards a consideration of what it means to write a traditional document like this, not just at this time, but from a later colonial position. And in particular, I'm thinking, you won't get the connection, and maybe you won't even by the end, but Martinique and Aimé Césaire, trying to produce a decolonizing document that will not get him caught in various kinds of statism and other things. So, but to this. The first consideration has to do with the actual composition of the proclamation as a manifesto. Like most political manifestos, it reconfigures hegemonic versions of history. It sets itself up squarely on the right side of virtue. They all do this. It makes use of a vocative or a prophetic voice, and I can talk about any of these generic signposts if you'd like. But above all, for my purposes here, it makes strategic use of that tricky pronoun we, which of course is really a small group of I's, usually with one leading I, called peers. And that I claims to speak for the whole under the cover of we. So this is the we that functions in traditional political manifestos as a voice of indeterminate numbers, a pronoun suggesting limitless kinship and indomitable mass resolve. So here it's purse as we, with some help from Connolly, speaking for a non-existent futural entity called the Irish Republic. In general, documents like these have done their work when the audience signs on as we. And in the Manichaean logic of the form, those who do not sign on are relegated to the discursive position of a hostile you, alongside the document's primary enemy. But here's the hybridity part, and this is a really strange document, and I'm sure it's lots and lots of people have done really amazing readings of it, but I'm an American, what can I do? Okay. So here's the hybridity thing, is that the political we does not make, oh, is that the wrong? No. Okay, sorry. So this is the beginning of the document, right? And the we, the document's we, doesn't appear in these first two paragraphs, right? The agent of the first two paragraphs is this mythic woman Ireland, she Ireland, right? Mother Ireland, Kathleen, all of them that we were kind of gesturing towards this morning. And she is really interesting, right? She waits and she watches and she trains up her manhood in secret and in the open, and she has chosen as conduits the us that is obediently summoning her children to the flag. The powerful mythic/mystical undertones of transubstantiation. She speaks through us. We are she, magically, Mishaer. These are laid down first by Pierce. These are his opening moves, in order that the enunciative political acts that follow may be layered over them. So there's this palimpsestic quality to the way that he sequences the document. It is the she Ireland who has acted first, and she has done so both in secret and in the open. The secret figure of Mother Ireland, who's been biding her time and knows the right moment to reveal herself, again, there's this secrecy of revelation, to reveal herself, follows some of the conventions of earlier political manifestos, which without exception foreground the urgency and inevitability of the present moment. The time for talk is over. No more discussion. The time for action is now. They all do this. All signs have pointed to it. We will wait no longer. But here the now, the right moment to reveal herself, issues not from the determinism of something like the Communist Manifesto, which is very, very like deterministic, but rather from a secret figure who encompasses all of we and who, in her historico-occult wisdom, has been waiting for this exact moment. And we won't say anything about the fact that the proclamation itself incoherently admits that there have been no less than 5 earlier moments of right now. This is the best moment. This is the only moment. That's fine. And her half-secrecy is doubled by the half-secrecy of her supporters, right? So the secret IRB, on the one hand, and the very unsecret, very open volunteers on the other. And Mary Harris did a wonderful job kind of going over that this morning, and I'm indebted. In his famous memoir of the Rising, W.J. Brennan Whitmore, who was one of the leaders of the volunteers, recalls first seeing the proclamation. It was hot off the press. He was in Liberty Hall. He looked at a table, and it was there. It hadn't been read yet. And he says, quote, "The sight of the proclamation of the Republic on that table in Liberty Hall gave me a profound shock. I thought of all the speeches I had made and articles I had written in which I had specifically laid down that the volunteer movement would succeed above all other efforts solely because it had no secrets in it. There was no secret organization behind this rising." He finds out, like minutes before, that not only is this not a volunteer show, but they get second billing to the secret people, right? The IRB. So he has like all this hurt friendship feelings. He's like, hey, I thought I was your best friend, and no, you're not. Okay. For the very first time, I now learned of the existence of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, and that it was a secret organization more than any, and it was the fact that it was a secret organization more than any other factor that had brought the glorious hour to fruition. End quote. He tries not to feel betrayed, but with that shock comes the recognition that secrets are the wellspring of the rising, and that the secret holders hold all the cards. So ultimately what's interesting to me about the role of secrecy in the proclamation is that it countermands the ethos of transparency that undergirds most polemics from the French Revolution forward. Right? This is the real discourse of transparency. You can read my heart. I've written it on my heart. You know, that's no, not here. So this is really fascinating to me. Now, and it brings me to my second bunch of questions. Right, so here we go. This is when the we comes in, and and then they're doing that political discursive act, but only after first having introduced this secret agent, this woman of history, this Mother Ireland, all of this stuff. Okay. Now, oh, please. Okay. This, as I say, it's kind of a rough transition, but a question that to me, because of the secrecy, because of the mythos underneath it, the mysticism, the occultism that undergirds those opening moves, I could smell post-colonial work in the Caribbean and other places too, where there's a kind of discursive covering all the time. So here, what does it mean to produce a revolutionary proclamation in a later phase of decolonization? And this is 1942. So this is Aimé Césaire. It's not even the same empire. This is the French. Aimé Césaire, who was born in Martinique, went to Paris, studied there, hung out with the Surrealists, was profoundly interested and influenced by them, coined the term negritude, went back to Martinique in 1941 with his wife Suzanne. And at this time, Martinique is now a Vichy-controlled territory of France. Several of the islands were free French, but not Martinique. So he's in Martinique, he's trying to get an anti-colonial movement going, but he also has multiple enemies. It's not just the colonial enemies anymore, now it's the Nazis, right? So he's got this multiple directed polemical thing going on. He starts this journal, Tropiques, and this is one of the first things published on it. I would call, he calls it a literary manifesto. And the name and the word in the title is Guys. It's very, very long. These are just little excerpts of it. But in this, there's an outright refusal of statism. Statism will get you World War II. There's an outright refusal of intelligibility. There's a refusal of demand. Intelligible will be turned against you. It's a trap. There are multiple enemies. This is secretive and coded, and you will understand it if you're with us, but that we is highly unstable. So we have the we, and we have the you, and then it flips to an I. And there's this language, and I won't read it for you, but this evasion of the language of the manifesto, and yet the passion, anger, hatred, and I'll stab you as soon as I look at you rhetoric of the angry fist of the manifesto is in here. Here it is secretive and coded. You understand us if you're us. But the we is highly unstable. It becomes an I pretty quickly. There's tons of occult language and mythic secrecy in here. And this drives an inevitability of this particular manifesto and others like it. So I see the Irish manifesto, the proclamation as different in degree, but heading towards being different in kind from an earlier century, really, political manifestos that leaves room open for a kind of post-colonial or decolonizing ethos that embraces its own myths over and against the dominant powers who would sort of like to decode everything and own everything. That's my thing.
That's wonderful. It's such a delight to be here with old friends and new. I think you'll find that Sarah Cole and I have been sort of tunneling in adjacent tunnels as we've been doing for years off and on. And also that this picture maybe, the image plugs in a bit to Emily's talk, because this is the telephone isolation booth in the GPO, which, as we've already heard, was a kind of a telecommunicative nerve center at that time, right? You also have to think TARDIS, but cooler, I think, when you see this picture. In keeping with our punctually commemorative occasion, I want to take up a work of commemorative modernism, Joyce's Ulysses, set entirely on a single particular day. Ulysses would seem at first blush to be punctuality's epic. But I want to suggest that for Joyce's book, timelessness, or rather timeliness, is less a design than a device, a kind of a way of smuggling in the untimeliness with which the novel teems. So I'm going to be leaning heavily on the untimely side of this equation.
And one crucial affordance of that untimeliness is a sideways look at the Easter Rising and what it augured, both for Ireland's future political form and for the rapidly changing world system of violence production. As a way of getting at that sideways look, I want to start with the broader but related question of Ulysses' anachronisms, if you'll permit me. The first generation of scholarship on Joyce's novel, and particularly on its contemporaneity as opposed to its mythical method, tended to focus on its fidelity to the culture and politics, the built environment, the population, and the archive of Dublin on June 16th, 1904, the day on which it's set. As scholars traced Joyce's mining of periodicals, directories, maps, and other sources, discrepancies between the novel and the historical record started to emerge. These tended to be understood, however, as rare moments of authorial oversight. Anthony Burgess, the novelist and critic, in his book Joyce Prick, calls anachronism the one Joycean sin. He adds that he troubles to point out the few allusions in Ulysses to books published after 1904 because, as he puts it, Joyce is otherwise so meticulous in keeping the known future out of his reconstructed past. It's only more recently that students of the book have begun to suspect that Ulysses' many departures from historical records and its violations of the 1904 frame might be neither reducible to its Homeric structure nor explicable as minor gaffes or glitches or Homeric nods. That anachronism might be one of the book's objects of scrutiny, one of its under-celebrated techniques, even one of its great themes. And fascinatingly, this emergent reading of Ulysses' anachronisms has been less to do with chronologically impossible quotations than with the book's oblique gestures toward two events that we've already been thinking about. The Easter Rising and the First World War. And this is an image you may well have seen. It was a photograph that was published on the cover of a Sinn Féin kind of commemorative book later in 1916 after the Rising. And the caption says, Ypres on the Liffey. So it's making explicit a kind of comparison between the devastation of the First World War and what happened to the city center of Dublin. I want to focus here on how the first of these, the Easter Rising, haunts Ulysses from the book's diegetic future. So just to remind you, this is a book written from 1915 to 1921, even early 22. But set in 1904. So we can think of Ulysses as a stream that sort of forks around the Rising, in a sense, and is kind of, brushing up against it from both sides. Declan Kiberd has described the Rising as a referent that may be transcendental by virtue of its effacement from the novel's direct reference world. Here he is. The Rising, he writes, is the great unmentionable fact which hovers behind so many episodes of Ulysses. The setting of Aeolus near the post office, which provided its headquarters, the triumph of failure motif in that episode and the library scene, the blood sacrifice theme of Lestrygonians, and the viceregal cavalcade in the Wandering Rocks chapter. Elaborating elsewhere on his reading of Aeolus, he adds that Stephen's Parable of the Plums is, quote, put into a quite different perspective by the fact of Easter 1916. By the time that Ulysses was published 6 years later, the triumph of lost causes argument no longer sounded so threadbare, for a hopeless rebellion centered next to the very site of all this verbalizing had led to the founding of an Irish Free State, end quote. For Kiberd, the Rising may be nowhere referred to, but it is everywhere implied, the more so when read by the hindlight of 1922, when its lose-to-win strategy had at least arguably prevailed. In Enda Duffy's discussions of Ulysses and the Rising, we find a focus on different episodes from Kiberd's work, particularly on Cyclops, whose procession of saints follows some of the streets hardest hit by British ordnance, and whose Jacob's biscuit tin, hurled with such fury by the citizen that the ensuing earthquakes devastate part of the city, commemorates the Jacob's factory occupied by the rebels. And also on the Circe episode, whose Dublin's burning passage evokes a Rising-like scene of urban military violence, with artillery firing and troops deployed in the streets. For Duffy, the gap between 1904 and 1922 allows Ulysses to, quote, secrete within its account of a day in 1904 a palimpsest or secret history of the revolutionary occurrences of 1914 to 1921. So there's our secrecy again. Yeah. Learning to read that secret history, he adds, reveals a certain latency or imminence or potential in Ulysses' portrait of the Irish middle class in 1904. It's a potential that the novel confirms by way of the post-1904 material transmitted on its sort of encrypted carrier wave. That potential will soon become manifest in the bourgeoisie's economic emergence, political awakening, and revolutionary struggle, culminating in the founding, again, of the Irish Free State. This palimpsestic reading leads Duffy to dub Ulysses much more even than Yeats's Easter 1916, right, which we've been thinking about a lot today, quote, the work that commemorates and celebrates a newly independent Ireland, the nation text of a new post-colonial middle-class Ireland. So both Kybert and Duffy give us a Ulysses whose historical commitment to June 16, 1904 is porous enough to welcome certain ghosts of Ireland's future. This is an untimely Ulysses, right? One that registers how the past is overwritten by supervening events, even as it insists that historical moments are never identical with themselves to begin with. And yet, if the Ulysses described by these eminent Joyceans is untimely, its account of the Rising as an event remains installed in a quite conventional linear narrative of state formation, in which the rebellion leads to the founding of the Irish Free State and the birth of the nation redeems the evident futility and blood sacrifice of the Rising. I don't want to treat this narrative dismissively, either as a historical object or as a narrative that may, for all we know, continue to have work to do in the present. But I'm not convinced that this is the only or even the chief way that Joyce's novel has of imploding Ireland's political future or of understanding the Easter Rising. It doesn't square, for one, with Joyce's antagonism toward the nation-state as a political form generally, or with his particular ambivalence about Irish statehood. Right? His friend Frank Budgeon asked him, do you support Irish statehood? And he says, yes, so that I can become its first enemy.
Their statism for you.
What's more, the plot of state formation doesn't square with the Ulysses that I think we find on the page, whose punctuality is less and less interestingly haunted by a known political future than by an unknown one. For Duffy, Ulysses' formal modernism intensifies alongside the anti-colonial struggle concurrent with the writing of its later episodes, reaching a crescendo in a crazed phantasmagoria of Circe written during the height of the War of Independence. That's Duffy again, with this kind of plot of state formation. As I read it, however, what crescendos in the later episodes is a refusal to presuppose the future political form of Ireland. And in declining to implot any sort of denouement to the plot of national becoming, the novel asks us to consider what more broadly emancipatory prospects were overwritten or made dormant by the Easter Rising and by the wartime nationalism that was one of its enabling conditions. So to test some of these claims, I want to briefly consider the Dublin's burning passage in Circe that I just mentioned, which again Duffy characterizes as the Dublin of the Easter Rising, full stop. Dublin's burning on fire, high explosive fires spring up, dense clouds roll past, Lewis guns boom, pandemonium, troops deploy, gallop of hoofs, artillery, horse commands, bells clang, rebels shout, civilians bawl, brigadiers screech, the HMS Helga hoots on the Liffey, cries of valor, shrieks of dying, gunmen crouch by barricades, looters empty the shops, the midday sun is darkened, the ground trembles, the dead of Dublin from Sackville Street to Little Britain Street lie interred in rubble. Part of Liberty Hall collapses from the shell of an 18-pounder. Volunteers make red-hot barra bombs in the offices of the Freeman's Journal. ICA ladies fire their Webley revolvers to protect themselves. Therese, a little while ago, asked us to develop an overlap between fiction and criticism, and well, here it is, because I've been cheating. This is actually not the passage in Ulysses. It's not the passage we find in Joyce's book, but one that I've conjured up as if it had returned from a counterfactual, unequivocally nationalist Ulysses. It's a passage that flagrantly commits the one